Welcome, everybody. We are so happy to have you here for our kickoff of our 10th annual summit. It's really exciting to have seen so many in the intro session earlier today. And I know many of you want to get to our keynote speaker. So I'm Julie Rizian. I'm from Oregon State University, and I'm the Science and Society Program Lead in the STEM Research Center here at Oregon State, and the Director of Transdisciplinary Research, Impact, and Advancement in our Office of Vice President for Research. I have been so honored to be part of the NSF NABI previously, and now ARIS leadership team since 2015. And last week, the leadership team had the opportunity to be together and do a lot of reflection. It has been a big decade for broader impacts, with the National Science Board reifying the importance of broader impacts in their report, and the NSF developing a lot of work around improving the practice of broader impacts through their granting programs. In that time, we have seen such a huge shift in the day-to-day practice of broader impact, supported so much by the professionals in this community. And I really do want to say that we are a community. We said that earlier. We are more than a professional organization where you go and you gather resources and you apply them in your work. In ARIS, people come together and they develop resources together. They test, they critique, and they innovate together. And we have been so proud to be part of that over this last decade. We've also seen a shift in how researchers express their values and their identity through their research impacts work. And we have seen much deeper and more meaningful engagement of leadership at both the institutional and national levels. Today, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce someone who has been an exemplar of that very institutional and national scale leadership. Dr. Alicia Knoedler is head of the NSF Office of Integrative Activities. And you can read all about the leadership she participated in prior to coming to NSF in 2021 in the attendee hub in her bio. But personally, I am most interested in optimizing her time so we can hear from her. Just a point of housekeeping. In the attendee hub in the upper right corner, there's a live Q&A. As you develop questions of Alicia, you can put your live Q&A in there. You can also upvote other people's questions. There is a moderator and questions will come to us at the end of the session. We have set aside a substantial time for questions and answers, and it's one of the most exciting ways for us to be kicking off this summit. So without further ado, I am so happy to turn this session over to Dr. Alicia Knoedler.
Thank you, Julie. It is a pleasure to join you and your colleagues here at ARIS for this opening session of the 2022 summit, and I'm so pleased to be here. I'm going to share my screen with some slides. And let's hope somebody will tell me if it doesn't quite organize the way that I think it should. So unless someone interrupts me, I'll assume it looks pretty good. And the talk that I have arranged here, it might be slightly different from past keynotes delivered by Susie Iacono, who was my predecessor at NSF as the office head of integrative activities. I have spent a long time in this kind of broader impacts and research development community. And so I wanted to use that experience and contribute in this particular presentation in that unique way. So I've titled this Accumulating Broader Impacts Knowledge, Challenges for the Next Decade, recognizing that hitting the decade milestone is significant, but it also allows one to think about, okay, look at all we accomplished. What can we be thinking about for the next 10 years, 20 years, and so forth? So I will get started. I love to give an overview because it helps people see kind of the brief roadmap of what I hope to present. And as Julie mentioned, I have left time for Q&A because I know that that's a great way in which to connect with the community. So I'll start with a little bit of reflection on my part, then talk a bit about the summit and some of the data and some of the things that I see in the context of the past 10 years and so on. Then I want to turn to some broader impacts challenges and then finish with some closing remarks. So to begin with, let me first think in a sort of 2x2 kind of way I want to provide a brief introduction to my background and put that in the context of ARIS and NABI. I also want to reflect on my thoughts around broader impacts from my experience outside of NSF. Then I'll turn to drawing on connections with for ARIS, but also for NSF. And then I want to talk about my plans as the head of OIA within NSF and what that means to ARIS. So I'll kind of wrap it back around. So just to begin with, I joined OIA in September of 2021, so that's not very long. I had been the Vice President for Research and Innovation at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I have spent the last 20 years of my career in academia primarily. I've had a few other experiences here and there, but generally trying to build research capacity at various institutions. So I spent time at the University of Notre Dame, Penn State, the University of Oklahoma, Miami University, and all of this has been kind of in the context of what is now referred to as research development. And I know that there are many ARIS members who are also part of the National Organization of Research Development Professionals, or NORDEP. I also know that there is now a NORDEP ARIS MOU and a desire to do more collaboration, which I fully support. And so I see a lot of points of intersection across how research development and broader impacts and the professionals in both of those communities have really developed over time. And one thing that I wanted to bring to this particular keynote, and given that it's my first one, I wanted to reflect back to when I was the president of NORDEP in 2013 and 2014. And I actually happened to be attending an EPSCoR national meeting, I believe. So EPSCoR is a program that sits in my office at NSF. And so I've been part of the EPSCoR community as well for quite a long time. And I was at the University of Oklahoma at that time, but I was president of NORDEP. I was at this conference and I had a phone call, or actually I think I was past somebody else's phone. And it was the organizers putting together the NSF Research Coordination Network proposal for what became NABI. And in this phone call, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who exactly I spoke to. I actually think I spoke to two people on that phone call. So they might have been in a meeting talking about, well, what are we putting into this proposal? And they wanted to really know about how we started NORDEP and how we were organizing NORDEP, kind of what was the backbone to NORDEP. And being the president at the time, and luckily I had been part of the steering committee to begin NORDEP, so I knew all of the challenges that we had and the things that we did, the decisions we made. And what is it that we were doing as a community? How were we developing the NORDEP community? And I enjoyed that phone call very much because it really caused me to think and reflect on, well, why did we make that choice? And how did that reflect, or how did that really allow us to build out in the way that we were building NORDEP at the time? We were only a few years into NORDEP at that point, 2013, 2014. So, back then I remember ending that call and thinking, this is fantastic that they have identified the Research Coordination Network as an opportunity to pull people together and start to find those points of intersection. We had done that not through an RCN, but a bunch of phone calls when we started NORDEP. And then we had one meeting that was at the University of Maryland, College Park. And that's where we had our aha moments of, oh my gosh, you do the same kind of work that I do. And I imagine that the broader impacts community, many people who have joined NABI and now ARIS have had those aha moments of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've found other people who do work similar to mine, where they're having the same kinds of challenges that I am having. They speak my language and so on. So I really know the value of building out these communities. And I see this as kind of a repeatable process that's happened across NORDEP and ARIS and so many other communities, where people are coming together, seeing a gap and wanting to fill it and figuring out how to make those connections. So that's kind of my own personal reflection in the journey of the last 10 years for NABI and ARIS. And, I see that ARIS, NORDEP connecting with ARIS, that's just one example, but I want to endorse the idea of connections. And one thing you'll see later in my presentation is how much NSF is really emphasizing partnerships, emphasizing these points of intersection, emphasizing how to play catalyst roles and leveraging knowledge. And to my title for this talk about accumulating broader impacts knowledge, figuring out ways in which to mobilize that knowledge, which I know ARIS has talked about in the past. What are we doing to really connect the dots? And that's something, again, throughout this talk, I hope you see some dots being connected, but I want to emphasize perhaps for the next 10 years and beyond for ARIS, that there's a real effort to map and make visible those connections and to emphasize those partnerships and draw out ways like MOUs or other kind of formal partnerships to show and allow people to say, yes, I'm part of that, or I'm part of building that, or I'm playing a role in that. I think it helps with belonging. I think it helps with forming these identities that the broader impacts community has really put in place, broader impacts identities and frameworks and so on. So I really want to emphasize how important that is and how I think that the visibility of that is important for ARIS going forward. And then finally, I want to end with some continuity remarks. So coming into OIA, again, hopefully you see that I have a lot of knowledge and background about ARIS and broader impacts. And so it's very important to me personally that we are able in OIA and NSF to continue to be supportive of ARIS. But I also want to be a challenging person for ARIS, and I want to encourage some stretch goals. And, I hope that we can be part of a conversation. I know that Susan Reno and I have talked many times about, well, exactly what is it that we can use across our points of knowledge. She also is part of the Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering, CEOS, which is an advisory committee to NSF. And she's a fantastic contributor in that community. And so we have a lot of points of intersection, but I want to see how we can really think about broader impacts, NSF partnership. What does that look like as we go forward in 10 years? How does it evolve from having a grant to something that is a sustainable partnership? We often guide our investigators and our proposals that are at our institutions and so on to think about sustainability plans. So what's the sustainability plan for NSF and ARIS? Those are conversations we need to have. So that's my sense of reflection. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight into where I'm coming from and where I want to go. And then the rest of my talk will continue to bring out some examples in this way. So it wouldn't be an NSF talk if I didn't show you some background information on broader impacts. And this talk is not a heavy backgrounder. So I am making a lot of assumptions that you know what broader impacts are, you know why they're connected to NSF. I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the talk about filling in gaps if you have them. But this timeline I have found is a really helpful guide so that people can see the evolution of broader impacts at NSF. And I realize it might be a little teeny tiny in terms of some of the text, but let me highlight a few things here. So it is the case that broader impacts as a concept are part of NSF's merit review process. And the merit review process is a process. It's not just a point in time where somebody submits a proposal or gets a proposal reviewed. It's an entire approach that we take to accept. We do the calls for proposals through solicitations and now BAAs. We have ways in which to organize those as the proposals come in. It might be by a deadline, it might be no deadline. We've done a lot more no deadline opportunities. But what still remains and has remained for a very long time since 1996 is that we have these two review criteria that are applied to every single proposal: intellectual merit and broader impacts. Now, it is the case that some programs have more review criteria that they employ. EPSCoR is a perfect example. There's many more review criteria that are used. But those two, intellectual merit and broader impacts, are the two merit review criteria that are the kind of standard part of this process that we use to review proposals. And so you can see from 1996 until 2020, there have been some changes along the way. Now, it hasn't been significantly in the terms of having completely different review criteria, but it's been nuanced on those different criteria. And I didn't share this slide, but I'm happy to kind of pull it up later, that there are certain mandates that have come from Congress. There are parts of NSF statute that go into the language and the way in which we talk about broader impacts. But what we do have a little bit more fluidity with is kind of the recommended examples or exemplars or categories, as I've put here on this slide, that provide investigators with, well, if I don't understand what broader impacts are, what's an example? And so in 2020, with the PAPG, or the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, there are now 10 BI categories that are listed there. And that does not mean, as you all well know, and I know you communicate this out to the broader research community, you do not need to address all 10 categories as your broader impacts. You pick what makes sense for your research program, and you can develop that over time. You can have a framework for your broader impacts. You can have a career-long look at your broader impacts, but that does not need to carry all 10 of those categories. It can be one, or a version of one, or something that's not even listed there. But we want to give enough examples so that people understand that this is how it is that the impact of the research program that you've been proposing in your work is carried out beyond the work that you are executing as part of a set of experiments, or a prototype that you're building, or a program that you're developing. So what is the reach beyond your own research program? And it wouldn't be an NSF talk if I didn't show a little data. So because the National Science Board, our oversight, our kind of board of trustees for NSF, they're very interested in broader impacts. And the broader impacts language and intellectual merit language comes from the NSB. And so if changes need to be made, that goes through the NSB. We certainly work with them from NSF's perspective. But they are very interested in, okay, well, if we have these 10 categories of broader impacts examples, which ones are used the most? Well, one thing we don't do, as you all probably know, is we don't have like a checkbox on the cover sheet of a proposal. We don't ask people to declare which broader impacts that they are using. People describe them. And then what we do is, after the fact, when we get proposals and look at newly awarded projects and so on, we can do some text analysis to understand where people are putting emphasis in their broader impacts. Now, if we had a checklist and people could just check a box and say, oh, I'm going to do broadening participation, or I'm going to do developing the workforce, that would be fine. But I'm a psychologist by training. I know that some people would be compelled to check every box because they might think that that's more competitive. And that kind of goes against the point we're trying to make here, which is really discovering where people are putting a lot of their emphasis. So these data help share what types of broader impacts, again, through text analysis. So there are some elements that aren't quite covered here, or that we couldn't determine based on the number of proposals that were considered. But this shows that there's not a distinction. There's not a more competitive broader impacts idea here, such that there are more awards than declines for a particular category or anything that way. But also the height of the bars show that across many, many proposals, from 2016 to 2019, nearly 50,000 proposals were considered, that there's not a significant difference within awards and declines, but broadening participation and developing the STEM workforce are the two that are more, they occur more often in these proposals and awards than other categories do. So let me talk a little bit about broader impacts perspective within NSF. So, and I have another slide here in just a few minutes where I'll talk about some of the activities that we do. But over time, I feel, and I think others feel as well, that broader impacts has certainly evolved in terms of understanding what this is. It's evolved within NSF, within the research community, within the National Science Board, and Congress. So kudos to NABI and ARIS as to how you all have helped that understanding evolve. And that's significant, I think. Broader impacts are, as you all know, one of two review criteria. They are not an outcome. It's a review criterion. It's not an outcome. You're proposing in your proposals what impacts you might be having, but this isn't an outcome. It's a review criteria. The concept of broader impacts is a review criterion. And broader impacts are not retrospective. Reviewers, when they are asked to look at broader impacts, they are told, think about the impact to come. This is the future and the potential for those impacts. It's not about what you've done already. So those are important delineators in the merit review process in particular. Broadening participation of underrepresented groups in STEM is one example of broader impacts, but I think you all know as well as I do that people see the word broad or broaden or broader and get confused and think that broader impacts and broadening participation are the same thing. They are not. Broader impacts is sort of the umbrella concept, and broadening participation is one aspect or example or category that we often talk about in the context of the work that we're doing in our programs. Broader impacts like intellectual merit differ based on a PI's area of expertise and the scope and the purpose of the program. And also, as I've already mentioned, there can be long-term, and I think maybe that's my next point, so I'm going to very quickly go through this. They don't have to be one-off ideas, different for every proposal. They can be a long-term view of building out capacity and broader impacts. You can have a framework and build out your identity. It doesn't have to be that you're always constantly switching up your impacts, but you want your impacts to be relevant and be able to explain in the proposals how they are tied to the research program, tied to what it is that you're trying to accomplish with the research. So these are some perspectives. I wanted to share those with you because I think it's important that you know that I know all this stuff, but also that I see this and I talk about this when I talk to others about broader impacts. It's part of my base of explaining things. And I also wanted to draw to your attention, in case you haven't seen it, but it's been out on the webpage, that for the 2022 ARIS Summit, there were several best of themes that are helping organize this summit this year. And I left all this text here primarily to just kind of give a little bit more background, some more context on each one of these. But I want to also highlight how diverse broader impacts are and how much expertise can kind of flow in and across these various areas. So thinking about broader impacts policy, thinking about the foundational work, the activities and such, thinking about it in the context of communicating science and communicating STEM, communicating the impacts of these of the work that we're funding at NSF as an example, broadening participation, and then also connection to those individuals who do a lot of the implementation of the broader impacts and figuring out how people are making connections in accessible but informal ways. So I applaud the organization of the summit. I think this is a great way to think about ways in which broader impacts have evolved, but it's also ways in which different parts of the community can kind of identify each other and say, you know what, I'm kind of an expert in the policy shop, and oh, I'm an expert in communications. Well, what can we do together? And going back to my point before about connecting some dots, I think that this is a great way to think about where are some points of intersection here. Now, I want to pose a few broader impacts challenges. And to do this, I'm going to first lay out my challenges, then I'm going to supply a little bit more information, and then I'll come back to some other ideas and details here. So first, I want to recognize that we have some recurring challenges related to broader impacts inside of NSF. So here are a bunch of things that we do. We help investigators, reviewers, and program staff understand broader impacts. We know that there's some desire to change some terminology in the context of broader impacts. We know that investigators complain to others that they find some of the language around broader impacts review criterion confusing. And so that might be an opportunity for clarification. We know that there are effective and evidence-based practices in broader impacts. We know that there are a community of broader impacts professionals. We know that there are ways to measure broader impacts activities and the development and use of impact measures. And we know, as I think was the theme of a year or two ago with the ARIS Summit, there's knowledge management and knowledge mobilization ideas in the broader impacts community. Within NSF, we're kind of wrapping our hands or our arms around that in a new way right now. So these are things inside of NSF that I wanted to make you all aware of. These are some places where we're working, we're figuring things out, we see opportunities. And I think it's important that you know all of this. It's not that we've got it all worked out, we're just doing business as usual. There are bumps along this road. And then nationally, I think there are a few other challenges related to broader impacts. One is kind of going back to knowledge mobilization, knowledge management, is the organization of the accumulated knowledge around broader impacts. I'm going to come back to each one of these. Valuing broader impacts work and valuing, we can have a longer conversation about this maybe in Q&A, but, how is it that sometimes at institutions, broader impacts, again, are given that they're maybe in the future or they will come later, that it's sort of a service or it's not held to the same intellectual merit kind of standards. It may not result in a publication. Maybe it will be a presentation, or maybe it will be some students who benefited, or maybe it will be a change in policy. But how do we value and reward that kind of work? I've talked about this with other institutions. I know that some institutions are building out broader impact centers. They're trying to figure out how to create awards at the university level to recognize people for broader impact. So what are some opportunities there? And then finally, the distribution of broader impacts knowledge and broader impacts professionals across all types of institutions and organizations. And I'll come back to that with an opportunity. So to answer some of these or give some more context around what's going on inside of NSF, I wanted to make sure that you knew that NSF has, among different ways of thinking about our work, we do have 3 pillars that we refer back to often. And this is part of Dr. Panchanathan, our director, his way of framing out NSF. So strengthening established NSF is the NSF portfolio that everyone knows and loves. And figuring out how is it that we are building out programs to support the different disciplines. We're trying to grow, and you might have heard the director say speed and scale. We grow at speed and scale. And so we're trying to figure out how do we really strengthen this into the future. We're also focused on broadening participation, which is often referred to as the missing millions, especially by the National Science Board. So connecting that with the STEM workforce and growing out the STEM workforce. And then accelerating partnerships. As I mentioned before, partnerships are a big deal inside of NSF and a big deal for the research community. So figuring out how to have sustainable partnerships and enable those in lots of different activities is an important thing we're looking for. And this chart here just shows the way in which we think about these 3 pillars as also being integrated in a cross-cutting way with other theme areas like climate and clean energy, equity for underserved communities, the discovery engine, or this core part of NSF's portfolio, emerging industries, research infrastructure. And then the last one is organizational excellence within NSF. That's something we call AOAM. But I think it's important for you all to see all these blended parts. And then you can also see on my background for Zoom here, we have some core values. When people write proposals to NSF, knowledge of these sorts of priorities, these organizing functions, these values are really important. It's important language to use in proposals to contextualize why NSF should be funding this work or why it's relevant to NSF. So I hope that this kind of material could be helpful to you and your investigators, your PIs in the proposal writing process as well. I also wanted to point out that we have some guiding documents that are fairly recent, and I wanted to point them out to you. We very, very recently issued a new strategic plan for 2022 to 2026. So I put the cover there. You can get that online. You can take a look at it, see all our goals and what it is that's guiding our work. The NSB's Vision 2030 has been around for a little while, but they continue to talk about it. We just had an NSB meeting last week, Thursday and Friday. There are YouTube videos where you can watch related to some of the areas of the Vision 2030, in case you want to connect to those. And then not too long ago, the budget request for NSF for FY23 was issued. You can get that online as well. That helps you show where are the investments proposed for things like equity for underserved communities, or climate and clean energy, or emerging industries. You can see where we've put money connected to those areas. So that's where you can get all that kind of information. So I also wanted to make sure that you all knew that NSF has a lot of conversations around broader impacts in different ways. So there are always conversations within directorates around broader impacts. And I think that that happens at the investigator program officer kind of level, but it also happens within the leadership within directorates and across directorates. We have at NSF, when we have reviewers come into NSF and they need to learn about the merit review process, also new program officers and new staff in other positions, we have merit review boot camp. That's what we call it, boot camp. And so you can learn about the merit review process, the importance of panels, of diversity on panels, and so on. And then for people who've been around for a long time, there's also a reboot camp to help them see how ideas have changed and how there's new guidance and all these kinds of things. So these are two important mechanisms to help with training around broader impacts. We have committees of visitors, and this is a way in which the merit review process is evaluated, and it helps us talk about the positives that come out of progress made in the merit review process. So for example, if we make changes with broader impacts, how do we communicate that out? How do we see the impact of that? Committees of visitors help us do that kind of work. We also, we know that in the committee of visitor reports, which you can get online, they're associated with each division within NSF, is that a majority of these reports call for greater clarification about the meaning of the broader impacts criterion. So we do hear that and see that. There are training for reviewers on broader impacts, and that's the link there that is publicly available. And then we try to include broader impacts professionals on committees of visitor panels. Now, one thing that's kind of slowed that down is the pandemic. We didn't have as many committee of visitor panels. So now that we're hopefully coming back into an in-person or at least hybrid kind of environment, more committee of visitor panels will start to meet. And we have a list of broader impacts professionals that have been shared with divisions so that they can select individuals to put into these panels and invite them to be members. And then data collection, as I showed you a graph earlier, there are many ways in which we can kind of get insights into broader impacts. And we have conversations inside the NSF about, well, how could we do that effectively? Is text analysis the right way to go? Should we be doing something different that helps our data collection? So that's ongoing. And I think that's a great opportunity, referring back to my prior call for connection between ARIS and NSF. I think this would be a great point of intersection for us. And previously, I mentioned the importance of knowledge management and being able to understand where knowledge is growing and changing and how it's being organized and made available to others. I clipped this from the ARIS website, and I think that this list is amazing, all of these resources that are available. I only took the top part of the web page just so it wouldn't be completely teeny tiny. But what's interesting about the organization of this page is that I can scroll down the page, and then when I hit a certain point, it refreshes and adds more resources and more resources and more resources, and it becomes this giant list. And it makes me think, well, if you're down several scrolls, can I find you? Is that easy for me to find? I can search. There's a way in which to sort resources and kind of filter them down. That's a great mechanism. But where's the way in which this kind of page captures who's doing this work? Who are some experts in these areas? If somebody tried something new, how can they share that they added something new? So what's the evolution of these resources, and how do you capture the history as well as that evolution? Those are knowledge management, knowledge mobilization questions. And NSF is very interested in how we do that, supported by technology, how we do that so that we are capturing how this knowledge evolves. And I think that that is an important inclusion and access question as well, because especially for people who are new to the broader impacts community, they may be overwhelmed by a lot of the information that's available. So how do you help people sort through it? How do they onboard into the community and start to establish their knowledge base in that way? Again, I don't have an answer for this, and I've actually really spent some time thinking about knowledge management, the way in which software supports this, the strength of the algorithms that help you search for information. So I get it. It's hard. This is a hard question, a hard nut to crack, so to speak, but I think it's an important one and an important area, again, of collaboration. So the next thing I want to talk about goes back to my earlier comment about including communities that may not currently be part of the ARIS community. They may not be completely connected in with the research enterprise and what it takes to be competitive for funding, not only for research, but programs in STEM education and so on. So NSF has recognized that we have a gap. We have a gap in reaching other communities that aren't as well connected to NSF. So in FY23, we have put in a request for $50 million to start a new program. This program is called Granted, Growing Research Access for Nationally Transformative Equity and Diversity. And the idea here is that we want to strengthen the nation's research enterprise. And this wheel here, this infographic for Granted, represents some of the research enterprise. And what's missing here, and I think that I would love to have a conversation with ARIS about this, is where does broader impact stand out? I've put it into research development, but maybe you would disagree with that. So I think that's a point of conversation we can have. We want to mitigate barriers to competitiveness and enhance research capacity at emerging and underserved research institutions. And in FY23, we are focusing the start of this program on minority serving institutions. But I want to make a big point right there. The benefit will happen or be associated with minority serving institutions. However, this is a call to the entire research community, the entire research enterprise. This is a way for non-MSIs and non-emerging research institutions to also be involved in the success of the nation's research enterprise. So I want to emphasize that, and I'm happy to talk more about it later. So then some of the activities, which we're still coming together, we're still trying to put some details together, but it's an FY23 program, so we have to kind of wait for that money to be appropriated. But we think that there are ways in which to spend some funds to enhance research administrative support and infrastructure at institutions that don't have as much of those services and support functions available. We want to support the growth of research administration leadership, because with that leadership, I think it enables the building out of greater capacity. And we want to partner with national and regional professional societies like ARIS to be able to be successful in this area. So I put that out there and hope that we can have some discussion. And last, I want to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. So I've emphasized knowledge about broader impacts. I've emphasized some challenge areas and some ways in which we can explore some points of intersection, some partnerships, and so on. But I also want to emphasize the importance of leadership. And because the director of ARIS and myself are closely connected to the Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering, in case you're not aware, the most recent report that comes out of CIOS, and CIOS has to issue a report every 2 years to Congress to tell Congress how is NSF doing with respect to broadening participation. And in the last report, it's focused on bold leadership actions. Bold leadership actions are things that NSF can do, but also the research community can do to enhance and bring forward more opportunities in research leadership in the context of broadening participation. Granted is an idea that is connected to this report. It's connected to a few other things as well, but there is a suggestion within this report on page 47, which is where there's a whole lot of different suggestions for bold leadership actions. But I encourage you to look at this report, take a look at that table of suggestions on page 47, and see what you might be able to tie your broader impacts activities, your proposals, other ways in which to say, oh, that's really important for us too. I think that I want to emphasize that when I put in my broader impacts ideas, or when I'm building that out for my career-long look of developing my broader impacts. So bold leadership actions, broadening participation, but also thinking about how we are making the research enterprise more equitable. Those are some significant goals for OIA, for NSF. And also I mentioned the importance of partnerships at NSF. Several years ago, but it was sort of a 4-year study inside of NSF. They focused on partnerships. What is it that NSF does in a repeatable way to emphasize partnerships, to make sure that they're set up to be sustainable? What do they look like? What kinds of ingredients do they need to have? Who stewards them? Who owns them? And so on. But this is very much activity that has to happen in the research enterprise as well. Your investigators might have collaborations with other colleagues and so on, but how they move from collaboration to partnership. Is there a difference? Is there a way in which that's going to move from one level of activity and importance to another level? When we talk about speed and scale, partnerships are an essential piece of what will help make institutions and investigators successful in partnerships and the importance of their research programs. And then finally, again, to my point about finding points of intersection between NSF and professional societies, or ARIS with other professional groups. What is it that you know about partnerships, developing them and sustaining them, that would contribute to that overall knowledge about what makes successful partnerships? So this landscape study is a great way in which to see NSF's perspectives on partnerships, but I think ARIS could absolutely develop their own partnership perspective and guides and so on. And I think that would be a real contribution. Perhaps you all already have it, but I didn't see it yet. So I'd be happy to be shown where that resides among the resources. So with that, I thank you very much for this opportunity to come and talk to you. And I look forward to questions, and I hope to provide some perspective and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Such a pleasure to sort of get the pulse of NSF through integrative activities, and also get to know you a little bit more and the background that you're bringing to this work. The questions are flying in, so I'm going to try to do some lumping, okay. As we do in the social sciences, and I'm going to put one question forward that's really about panels. And so related to your consistent challenges that you put forward, we know that the practice of panels, it differs across the directorates, across the programs, and across individual panels based on sort of who's in the room. Maybe the power with which they use their voice may impact it. But there's sort of 4 things that were coming up about panels. And it has to do with the way that they're prepared to assess proposals. One is about the data or background information they're given about broader impacts that could help them perform valid assessments of broader impacts activities that would make those eventual future outcomes possible, right? So we talked about broader impacts not as an outcome itself, but that there are activities that are required to kind of get to that outcome. So how are they prepared in that way? Another one is how might they be prepared, or do you have any insights on the balancing of proposed activities needing to suggest or explore transformative potential versus, and then balancing that with the sort of tried and true and very evidence-based processes of broader impacts. Certainly, this is a large topic of conversation in the community, and we see a lot of room for both, but we also see a lot of inconsistency about when one seems to be prioritized over the other. So that's the second one. And I can repeat these as we go because I clumped a lot of questions together. And the third one is about, you mentioned that broader impacts and broadening participation are distinct. And what kinds of discussions go on with preparing panels to understand that distinction and be able to assess both of those things.
Okay. Well, I'm going to actually go for what I think is the easier thing first. And that's this confusion over, do broader impacts need to be new or can they be evidence-based? And the language there, and I know there's a lot of ways to ask that question, but it kind of comes down to when we think about research ideas that are being proposed, oftentimes you have to say why this is a new contribution into that research space, the discipline or whatever area it is. In disciplines, there's not necessarily an engineering broader impacts or a bio broader impacts or a this or that. So there's not that disciplinary assessment that comes along with broader impacts. And so it's a little harder, I believe, for non-broader impacts experts to say, well, this is new or this is not new. And I think a lot of the burden is placed on the investigator to do a freaking fantastic job with their broader impacts. And I know I've helped investigators as well as myself write many, many proposals, many NSF 15-page proposals. It is hard to put in all of the intellectual merit work that you feel you need to do to stand up to the reviewers that are in your discipline. And oftentimes broader impacts gets fewer pages for the description. And so maybe there's less room based on how you organize your proposal to really get into the details about your broader impacts. And I think this is where the idea of what I understand broader impacts frameworks to be, or the way in which someone can carry a framework into their own research programs and start a research or start a broader impact section by saying in a proposal, my choice has been to develop a long-term program for my broader impacts. And in doing so, I have built out this framework for evaluating and assessing my broader impacts. I have these measures, I have this, this, and this. I have borrowed from social science disciplines or my own discipline or whatever it is, great methodological expertise to show that I am growing my evidence in this way. And maybe you do that from the outset, or maybe you evolve into doing that. I don't think there's one way to do this. There's no one right way to do this, but it is important that investigators take the time to give the context to the program that they're trying to build out. And if they don't have a framework or a program or a career-long look at their broader impacts, and instead what they're doing is saying, okay, well, I want to put forward a new program that I want to make relevant to this particular proposal I've put in, it's okay then to say, this is new for me. This is something that it's novel, it's exciting, it's different. But I'm also creating measures to make sure I can assess whether it worked or not, or whether I can see it working when it does start to work, or how I'm preparing after I do my research to see the impact that I'm imagining will happen. And both of those are legitimate. And I know that, and I think you all know that. How do we tell reviewers and program officers inside of NSF that you all need to come to NSF and tell us that? You all need to help us with our materials. If you see, I gave you a link to some of the committee of visitor material that we put out there. Assess that for us. Tell us what you would do to improve that. Get engaged in this conversation. It is very much about us being knowledge and thought partners together to improve this. You all have evolved over 10 years. Have we evolved at the same rate, at the same time? You tell me. So let's get that together and let's help each other in that way. But I want you all to know, I see the difference. I see that novel and evidence-based or longer term growth of broader impacts, both of those are legit, but we have to help people see that they're both okay. And what are some good exemplars there, or how do people recognize how to assess that? So then to the other question of assessment. So let me do that one a little faster because of what I've just said. there is this language, there are principles and elements in the merit review criteria in the PAPG. And if you as a broader impacts professional haven't read all of that and maybe memorized it or created a document so you can refer back to it, I would strongly encourage you to do that, because that's sort of that's the lexicon that we use to say this is the frame that reviewers are given when they are assessing broader impacts. And they are asked to assess the strengths and weaknesses of those things. Those principles and elements are put forward to them. That's the basis of the training. But having broader impacts professionals on review panels, on committees of visitors, on all of the assessment that we do at NSF is really important. So volunteering to be a reviewer, putting your CV, giving your CV to directorates, doesn't matter if it's your discipline or not, share your CV and volunteer to be a reviewer. If you want to sit on an STC review panel, because that's big and that's a lot of stuff, put that. They need them just as much as a program within a division needs a broader impacts expert. So I encourage you to volunteer. Now, right now, the way we guide you to volunteer is to send your CV to somebody. You can send it to me. I am happy to push it on to others. I'll stop there. That was probably a lot.
I heard something very sage in there, which is in general framing your broader impacts. And so I would suspect, and I would encourage people not only to read the PAPG, but also the individual solicitations, which often go deeper into the requirements. But that framing your broader impact section around, it is my choice and intent to do it this way, absolutely, I think is valuable advice, not just for how transformative or evidence-based and how much of this is a legacy program that you're continuing to build, but also for how is broadening participation part of my broader impacts as well as part of other things. So I think that there's a lot in there in how we frame our broader impact statement. And I'm not sure there is a sense among the research community that we have permission to state our intent. So I think that was very sage advice.
Sure.
Okay, so here's a lightning rod that has been upvoted a lot. You talked about broader impacts rewards and talked about some universities having strategies to develop awards in order to reward good broader impacts work by the research community. And we wondered, and it should be noted, there's a lot of work with the national associations, university associations working towards improving promotion and tenure processes. And also there are a lot of people who are not on the tenure track who contribute substantially to broader impacts work, and their reward system also is worth addressing. But I wonder if you had other insights to dig a little deeper beyond the give people awards. And I like the way the asker of this question framed it, which is leaving these meetings with so much excitement that gets deflated when you're in meetings that talk about promotion, advancement, and tenure.
So again, going back to my partnership piece, there are organizations, APLU, Council on Research, AAU has their research leaders who get together. Oftentimes, awards, university level awards, might sit in, especially in a research context, sit in a vice president, vice provost, vice chancellor's office. And many of you all might be associated with those offices. And I know when I've been at universities, if we were going to have a research award, it would sit in that kind of office. Now, I know that colleges have research awards and maybe even departments do. So there are different ways in which to put these into place. But if you wanted a university level award, then, and you wanted to somehow insert that into promotion and tenure, often the award might sit in the VPR or VCR space, but the promotion and tenure sits in the provost space. And the gap between those two can be quite big. So you have to be a good manager up the chain, in a sense, about being able to say what's important about this kind of recognition of the work here. And again, NSF, when we talk about our 2 review criteria, we do not say, and I want to emphasize the not, we do not say that intellectual merit is more important than broader impacts. These are 2 review criteria. They are 2 review criteria. That we don't like tier them or anything that way. So intellectual merit and getting publications and other kinds of signs of research success. One might label that as intellectual merit. If it's harder to recognize what are the outcomes of broader impacts, an award or some kind of recognition for that, or again, having measures and so on, those are ways in which people can start to recognize the value of that. But an award at a university is a great way to do that. But if you just say to a VPR, VCR, hey, can we have a broader impacts award? And you haven't spelled out exactly, well, what would that, how would that be stood up? And what would we be looking for? What are the criteria for assessment and so on? So it's going to be very hard for that very busy person to say, absolutely, we should be doing that if there's not one already. And so I would encourage, and you guys could do it as part of a conference like this or conversation, or apply for a workshop. You know, we have workshops and conferences as part of the PAPG. That's just one of those general proposals that you can submit. Do an awarding or recognizing the value of broader impacts proposal. Have a conference and then issue a report and make sure that every single university leader gets a copy of that report. And you need translators inside the university to talk about it a lot. Give a presentation inside the university about what is that report all about and what does it say and what are some takeaways. So mobilize your knowledge and do it in a way that the community comes together, but put something out in a document or a way to mobilize that work so other people can see it.
Okay, we have time, I think, for just one more,
Okay.
Although there are so many questions coming in. So those of you who asked them, thank you so much. I'm doing my best to clump together.
Could you like pass them on to me? I'm happy to answer them and then route them back through you all.
That is such a generous offer, and we will absolutely find a way to make that work. Thank
Okay.
you so much, Alicia. So this last one is about the different directorates. They often have senior advisors or experts on their staff, might be disciplinary experts. And they, bring something to the table. What would make it possible to have directorates also have sort of impact experts on their team, people with broad knowledge about the types of impacts and impacts activities that may really support the directorates having a really kind of strong collective impact through their awardees?
So just by asking that question gives me ideas about how I can go and talk with my colleagues. So thank you for the question. The other thing I might suggest is, because the directorates, much like we have colleges and most of our universities that kind of can be a little siloed, directorates have communities of people who pay attention within their communities. So if there are broader impacts that align really well with math and physical sciences, or with engineering, or with education and human resources, or with social, behavioral, and economic sciences, if there are ways in which to identify those broader impacts and the experts who generate knowledge in those spaces and make them known in a very kind of expert-driven way to the leadership within those directorates, then it might be easier for them to recognize them as disciplinary, connected experts, as opposed to just anything goes, or this can, and even if I could say, oh, well, that works in NPS, I bet it can work over here too. Don't worry about that part. Just worry about communicating inside that community so that it's recognizable. And then people with perhaps a little translation and help can start to see that application and how it's relevant, and then have the aha moment of like, oh yes, we need to include people in this way.
Thank you. Alicia, you offered us so many calls to action to leverage.
Good.
Well, a lot of us have a disciplinary background that is not supporting broader impacts, including you. And I think you gave us a lot of calls to action on how to leverage that disciplinary background and expertise that we might bring to the table, even as our careers sometimes evolve into more support structures for broader impact. So I appreciate that. And that is, of course, reaching out to be on panels, reaching out and sharing that you have expertise to bear and reaching out to let the directors know you're available for community of visitors and all kinds of things. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities. Something I heard as a theme was also not to hold back in communicating. Communicate with the people who work at NSF. I think, again, sometimes we don't give ourselves permission to do that. There's sort of a sense of a black box that we maybe don't take as many opportunities as we can to reach across and communicate with a human person who can give us context and direction. And I think that that's really valuable. Quick announcement. Thank you so much for Alicia. I wish we were in person so we could see the excitement inevitably on people's faces for learning all the things that you had to share. With that, we're going to close out this session. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you everybody for the energy you're putting into kicking off the summit this year.